John's got his hands in his pocket and then within 1 minute, he was shot.
Nobody should be murdered.
When you look at the amount of firearms offences that we deal with in Essex, they are nothing like this.
These were kids with guns.
If you'd have said to me that a murder would happen just around the corner from my house, I wouldn't have believed it.
We're not used to gun crime in Chelmsford. You wonder what the hell's going on.
So there was clearly a forensic awareness amongst them.
How have these boys got the knowledge at their age to get rid of evidence?
People don't think that kids can access guns.
No mother believes that that will happen to their son. It's just not in Chelmsford.
Located 40 miles northeast of London, Chelmsford in Essex was once a sleepy commuter town, but has grown in recent years and in 2012 gained the status of a city. But 5 years later, in 2017, Chelmsford was making headlines for the wrong reasons, after 34-year-old John Pordage was shot dead in front of this petrol station.
I was brought up in London. Things started to change a lot. It just wasn't the community anymore. And I thought maybe it's a time now to move. I knew Chelmsford a little bit. At that time it was a market town. It was nice, and we moved a week before John's 9th birthday. The day he started school there, he came home and it was as though he'd been there all through the terms. He just fitted in. It just seemed perfect. From when he was 6 years old, his friends, wherever he went, wherever he made friends, will be a big part of his life. He always wanted to please other people.
I met John in September of '92. We was 9 years old. We hit off straight away. If you ever had a problem, you'd always go to John. Always make time for you. He always wanted to be the one that would help people.
I had a pet tarantula that didn't have a house or anywhere to live when I moved in with my girlfriend, and he took it in and looked after it. That's how we became friends.
He's a great artist. He was always talking about travelling and maybe eventually setting up his own company. So John was always full of aspiration. He definitely found his home in the gym. He was a massive, massive guy. He would fill a doorway. John was just larger than life. He'd literally walk into a pub or, you know, wherever he walks into, and people would almost subconsciously form a queue to actually go and see him.
Johnny, go. Go, John.
Girls wanted to be with him, blokes wanted to be him.
John didn't have to text anybody to see if they was about. Obviously that night he met Jamal in Chelmsford Town Centre.
If you'd have said to me, you know, when I started the job 8 months before the shooting took place, that a murder would happen just around the corner from my house, I wouldn't have believed it. The police put out a press release, I think maybe about 4, half 4, 5 o'clock, which said a murder investigation had been launched in Great Baddow.
In the early hours of August 5th, 2017, after a night out in Chelmsford, John and his friend Jamal pulled up at a BP garage, a mile from the city centre.
Come up to the garage to buy fizzy drinks and some cigarettes, and they sat talking for about 10 minutes. About 2 o'clock in the morning, the blue Ford Fiesta pulled onto the garage and pulled up onto a different pub on the other side of the forecourt. So the two cars were pretty close to each other, they were on opposite pumps. Shortly after the blue Ford Fiesta arrived, John and Jamal had gotten out. It didn't take long for any comments to be made between the two groups. Exactly what said, we actually still don't know. The blue Ford Fiesta was then driven off back towards the city centre of Chelmsford. As they drive off, the window of the passenger seat comes down and a hand is seen to come out. John and Jamal can clearly be seen sort of laughing and joking between themselves, not caring the world, not having any kind of idea of what actually was going to happen next. And some boys walk onto the forecourt
It's the eternal question, and it'll always be the question, why? Why did they do it?
John and Jamal see them. Two groups do eventually come together onto Badder Road itself. It's not captured on CCTV because the cameras aren't designed to do that. What we do know is that a kosh was pulled, and the kosh was used to strike John on the arm and on his upper body, and that John defended himself. The CCTV shows feet moving up and down. Eventually, 2 shots are fired. One must have been shot in this direction because it struck a telephone box at the edge of the forecourt, and you can actually still see the mark that was left at the top. One bullet struck John in the chest. The 3 boys then run back to the Fiesta and make away, leaving a very traumatised Jamal Samuels behind.
The bullet went straight through John's heart. He died on the forecourt. After a night out, John Pordage and his friend Jamal were confronted at a petrol station by 3 teenage boys. Moments later, John was shot through the heart and died on the forecourt.
I was in bed, and all I could hear was this bang, bang, banging on the door, and it just rocked. I thought, oh God, I've overslept. And I ran downstairs and I saw these 2 men standing there. One of them I could see was a uniform. And he said, "It's the police, can you let us in?" And they said, "You know John Pordage?" I went, "Yeah, my son." And he just stood there, the copper, and said, "John had been shot and he's dead." And that was it.
My wife said to me, she said, someone's been shot in Chelmsford, and said it's John. It's John that's died. You're just thinking, no, it's not. He's not dead. It's not John. You've got it mixed up. It must be another person.
Across Essex, on FM, online and DAB. This is Radio Essex.
Good morning, I'm Martin Harris. A man's been shot dead outside a petrol station in Chelmsford. 34-year-old John Pordage was standing with another man outside the BP garage on...
If I start an investigation, that's all I and my team will want. We want to find the truth. I'm Martin Passmore. I'm a Detective Chief Inspector with Major Crime in Essex Police. When you look at the amount of firearms offences that we deal with in Essex, they are nothing like this. You can imagine quite quickly we get into the CCTV. Of course, the first thing that comes out is the vehicle. We then started searching for that car, and we actually stop-checked the vehicle with the owner driving it, who is the father of an 18-year-old young girl called Ella Colgate. From speaking to Ella and getting some basic information, we realised that she was in the car that night with her friend Florence Laws. They open up to us about what happened that night.
Under questioning, Ella Colgate and Florence Laws reveal they had not been driving alone. They gave the names of 3 boys that were in the back of their blue Ford Fiesta.
These lads in the back of this car were our key individuals that we really needed to get a grip of as quickly as we possibly could. We've got our juvenile that's obviously we're not naming because of his age. We've got Saul Stanley, got Bradley Blundell.
17-year-old Bradley Blundell was on bail for drug dealing and possession of knives. At the time of arrest, he was a juvenile of previous good character. Therefore, police took the view that an application to remand him in custody was unlikely to succeed, so he was bailed.
There is an argument that he shouldn't have been on the street at all. He was on bail for a series of quite serious offences, including possession of Class A drugs and possession of 2 weapons in public. It's just astounding, really, and I don't think he should have been out in public. I think he was very clearly a danger to other people.
The events leading up to John's murder started 10 miles away in Brentwood with the purchase of a stolen motorbike.
On the evening of August 4th, Bradley Blundell, Saul Stanley and the other teenage boy all decide at some point that they need to go and buy this stolen motorbike. Neither of them drove, so they needed to find someone who could actually get them to the stolen motorbike. And that's where Ella Colgate came in. Bradley Blundell offered Ella Colgate £40 so she would take him, the unnamed boy, and Saul Stanley to Brentwood so they could collect this stolen motorbike. After collecting the boys, she picked up her friend Florence Laws from her home, and then they all drove off to Brentwood together.
The juvenile rode the motorbike, whilst the other teenagers followed in the blue Ford Fiesta.
It came to a point where both vehicles started to run out of fuel, so the decision was made that they had to go and buy petrol from somewhere. They drove to the Chelmsford village Asda petrol station. But none of the machines would accept any of the cards that were tried. They would have to go to another petrol station. The nearest station that they could think of was the BP garage in Baddow Road.
Around 1:45 a.m, John and his friend Jamal are on their way to buy cigarettes and a fizzy drink. 8 minutes later, they arrive at the BP garage on Baddow Road. Shortly after, Colgate's blue Fiesta pulls up alongside.
Ella Colgate and the boys, they were unable to put fuel in the motorcycle at the Asda garage, so they leave the motorcycle there. By 1:59, we have Ella Colgate driving onto the forecourt, pull up directly next to John Pordage, who's still in his van chatting to Jamal. This is where there are some comments, nice bum, something like that said by one of the guys, either John or Jamal. And the boys perhaps start to react to that. Certainly Bradley Blundell is picking up on this. But Ella fills up with petrol. She's concerned, I think, because she knows the reaction. She even locks the car and tells the boys to just calm down. When you look at the CCTV and you can see the expressions on John's face and on Jamal's face, this is light-hearted banter. And actually it's over. I think it's already over at this point. They're just up there chatting and taking not that much more notice. But of course Ella then drives out of the forecourt and we can see maybe 40, 50 yards down the road we have this situation where clearly Bradley and perhaps the juvenile have had enough and they are angry. They push the car seats forward, forcing Ella to stop the car, and then all three boys alight from the vehicle. We know that Saul Stanley just hangs back out of camera shot. He's never seen on the CCTV at all, but we can clearly see the juvenile and Bradley Blundell come onto the forecourt.
John's got his hands in his pocket and then within 1 minute, he was shot.
It moves into the road, well out of camera shot. We don't know exactly what's going on at this time. The next thing we know after a few seconds is sadly we then see John come onto the forecourt and he collapses down here where we can see the flowers.
John was such a big character around town, in Chelmsford in particular. Everybody knew him or knew of him, so, you know, you'd hear about it in the hairdressers, or you'd hear about it going down the shops, or you'd see his face on the newspapers day after day, because it was something that everybody was so impacted by, because nobody ever imagined that it would happen. These were kids with guns.
When we heard that it was teenagers who were involved, you know, young 16, 17-year-olds, it just seemed even more pointless.
We're not used to gun crime in Chelmsford. Teenagers with guns. You wonder what the hell's going on.
So we had our suspects, but who was it standing there when it started? Let's work backwards, let's find the CCTV earlier in that day of those same individuals. Let's get the fine-grained detail of that clothing in other shops, other areas. They may have walked past other CCTV within the town. Luckily for us, when we did find that clothing earlier on in the day, there were little tears and nicks and things within the clothing. We were able to say without a doubt, person on the left, unnamed juvenile, person on the right, Bradley Blundell. Where are they now?
Biggest thing with that family was actually viewing John's body in the mortuary and identifying him.
You go in now and you can't go near him, and because it's a crime scene. Because John is a crime scene. So why he's laying there? They're doing whatever they want to do, but I cannot kiss or touch John. Nothing.
When the boys get back in the car, Florence, I think, is in deep shock, not understanding what has happened. So she's looking behind her and she sees Bradley with what she's sure is a gun, a small gun, in a bag, wrapped up in a sort of blue plastic bag. Bradley Blundell was making it clear that this can never be discussed again.
At 2:56 a.m, CCTV shows Ella Colgate and the teenagers 10 miles from Chelmsford, driving towards the salt marshes of Malden.
Bradley Blundell directed them to this location, obviously somewhere he had in mind. They took the petrol and they proceeded to set some fires and start burning the clothing that they were wearing. Bradley Blundell had washed himself in petrol, so there was clearly a forensic awareness amongst them to deal with that aspect of gunshot residue. We found areas of burnt grass, we found some buttons from jeans, and it started to transpire really that it was Bradley Blundell that was directing the actions that took place here.
You think to yourself, how have these essentially boys got the knowledge at their age to think, right, I'm going to douse myself in petrol to get rid of evidence? You know, what 17-year-old boys, you know, how do they know these things?
So we've got our names, but what are their current mobile numbers? If they're using those phones, then we can start to track the movements of them. Incredibly, having gone through all of that the night before, by midday that afternoon, Bradley Blundell was some Selfridges in London shopping for his girlfriend. You know, it just gives you an insight into the mindset of this individual at such a young age.
After the London shopping trip, CCTV shows Blundell back in the Chelmsford area with Saul Stanley and the juvenile. But by night time, the three teenagers' phones had moved 100 miles north to Norwich.
How does a 17-year-old have the facilities to go on the run and basically stick one finger or two fingers up at the police?
Now, as it transpired, Juvenile gave himself up quite early, you know, 6th or 7th of August. But on the afternoon of the 7th, I then decided to name Saul Stanley and Bradley Blundell as individuals that were wanted. And Saul Stanley, I think the next morning, gave himself up.
We had two in custody. We were one outstanding, Bradley Blundell.
And of course, the phones become even more key when you've got a manhunt. You can see that his mobile phone moves towards Enfield in London. And then it goes off grid.
We didn't know where or how we were going to find him.
And there we are, suddenly saying to Sue Wilson quite early on this, when we know Blundell's gone on the run, to put her in front of cameras, the media, and then do an appeal.
And the more people that are looking for Bradley, the more chances that he's going to be found.
I just wanted to think about John, and yet I've got to talk about asking about him. Made me feel angry, really.
To lose your child is unimaginable. But to lose your son so violently and needlessly is beyond words. The police are doing all they can to catch these responsible and understand what happened to my son, John. But they are still trying to chase 17-year-old Bradley Bundle.
Earth-shattering to see Sue with her first appeal. You know, there's a lady you've known for 30 years, literally dying in front of the camera.
Bradley, if you are listening to me, please do the right thing and hand yourself in. It's only a matter of time before the police catch you.
Local electrician John Pordage was shot in the early hours of August 5th, 2017. A 16-year-old boy and another teenager are in custody awaiting trial. A third boy, 17-year-old Bradley Blundell, is on the run.
My name is Alan Compton. I was the second junior barrister for the prosecution. There was obviously an enormous amount of police activity in the aftermath, and one of the issues at the forefront was how on earth are 17-year-olds wandering around with loaded guns in Chelmsford?
It may have city status, but to have people walking around with guns just puts you off of coming in, full stop.
Kids with guns just getting out of hand.
Why were they carrying around weapons? Does this happen a lot in Chelmsford? You start asking yourself those sort of questions, especially when you've got children growing up in the area. It's scary.
In the immediate aftermath of the shooting, a series of police raids uncovered a stash of firearms and ammunition.
Saul Stanley was linked with scientific evidence to that cache of weapons. It was not the firearm which was used to kill John Pordage, but nonetheless, the group of boys all had ready access to firearms.
Saul Stanley is charged with possession of firearms and ammunition. He will also stand trial for perverting the course of justice and handling stolen goods.
There was a march through Great Baddow into Chelmsford which ended at the cathedral. It was a vigil to remember John. It was called the Justice for John March.
It was just a feeling of immense sadness walking through the town that, you know, John spent, you know, great years of his life in. The town centre just does remind you of John. A part of the march halfway through where we stopped and a few people came out of a bar and started clapping. They probably knew John. Lots of people knew John, but it was really humbling. It was just part of the process of saying goodbye, really, and reassuring ourselves and reassuring John's family how much he was loved and how much people were willing to give.
Saul Stanley and the juvenile were awaiting trial, but police still had no idea of the whereabouts of the prime suspect, 17-year-old Bradley Blundell.
You can imagine this was the most important thing going on in Essex at that time. We threw everything at it to try and get him in those early days. It was then, I think, that we started to realise that perhaps he had moved out of the country.
I never thought that someone could get away with this in this town, let alone flee the country.
It was frustrating, really, to be honest with you. I mean, I was quite angry with the police.
But it's fair to say, yes, hands up, we don't actually know where Bradley Blundell is at the moment. We need to really start pushing this issue now. We are doing work behind the scenes. We worked with the National Crime Agency. We were able to see that he'd gone abroad, and then the intelligence flow started to change, that he had perhaps moved through France and had gone into Spain.
With only one of the murder suspects in custody, proving which of the two teenagers fired the gun was going to be a challenge.
We can see from the CCTV that we've got two individuals. They're moved completely off camera. Bradley Blundell could easily turn around and say, no, it was Juvenile, and Juvenile could say, it's Bradley Blundell that was the shooter. Two individuals like that blaming each other, that's what we call a cutthroat defence.
If only one of the suspects is on trial for the murder, then the prosecution's job of convincing the jury is made far more difficult.
We can see the potential for the cutthroats, we can see the potential for them to blame each other. We now need Blundell.
Despite Blundell still being on the run, legal custody time limits meant a court date was set for January 2018. Saul Stanley and the juvenile would stand trial together. As well as perverting the course of justice and handling stolen goods, the juvenile was charged with murder.
We had to go to court with juvenile on his own and with Blundell on the run.
It was just frustration because I thought they all need to be together.
The family very much wanted everybody in that car to be arrested because they felt that everybody was involved. But without witnesses, we wouldn't have anybody to put Bradley, Saul and the juvenile in that car and in that incident.
I believe, and many believe, there was no way that them two girls, especially Ellie Colgate, should not be charged with assisting a murder. They all got back in the car, they drove them to drop them off, they drove home and they both fell asleep. All that, and you went to sleep, in my eyes. They were all part of it.
The prosecution case against the juvenile for murder was that he, together with Bradley Blundell, had killed John Pordage, that they were both armed, the juvenile with a kosh and Bradley Blundell with a gun, and that as they came out of the car, they perpetrated a joint attack on John Pordage.
The one key witness to the murder was John's friend Jamal, but his statement was of little help to the prosecution's case.
His view was that the person with the kosh had blonde hair and the person with the gun had brown hair. And we could already see how difficult that was going to be for us to get across to that jury that actually Jamal, for reasons of going through a traumatic experience, has got that wrong.
Jamal's original statement contradicts the prosecution's case that Blundell was the shooter. They must rely on the CCTV to convince the jury.
Blundell, you can see, in my view, has got one hand in a pocket. I would suggest that's because he's got one hand on the gun. When we look at our juvenile, that CCTV clearly shows what I would say is a kosh in his hand. And our case was, both of you have gone out there to cause really serious harm to these individuals, knowing that you could because you had weapons.
The jury have been played CCTV which shows the moment before, after and during John Pordage was shot at the BP petrol station in Great Baddow. Tomorrow we will hear the first witness evidence.
Oh, Ella Colgate was a bit of a nightmare in that trial, actually. I think the family were quite unhappy about how she gave evidence, first of all, because they felt that she'd held back on some of the details, that she was doing what she could to help the people that were sat in the box, as in telling the story in a way that supported the two defendants.
Our juvenile goes forward to court saying, yeah, that's me. I'm the kosh man, and I was defending Blundell. And yes, I hit John Pordage a couple of times in self-defence.
When you're prosecution counsel and waiting for a jury to come back, it's always a difficult moment because you don't know what's going to happen. Anything can happen, and it could be a conviction or it could be an acquittal, and those two things are very different.
The 16-year-old boy on trial for the murder of John Pordage has been found not guilty today at Chelmsford Crown Court this afternoon. The teenager, who we cannot name for legal reasons, was cleared of the charge after less than 6 hours of jury deliberations.
The jury believed that he didn't know that Blundell had the gun on him and may well have acted in self-defence in the situation he found himself in with John Pordage. And that's the nature of our system. That's what the jury found.
He got sentenced in relation to some of the other matters, and of course Saul Stanley was sentenced in relation to the firearms, but it doesn't really feel like enough, does it?
They acquitted the juvenile of the murder. And so Sue Wilson was left with the fact that, as far as she was concerned, nobody was responsible.
What a waste of, what a waste.
No one was found culpable for John's murder. As feared, the defendant pointed the finger at Blundell, whose whereabouts were still unknown. Stanley and the juvenile were convicted of perverting the course of justice and handling stolen goods. Stanley was also convicted for the firearms offences and given 5 years in prison. The juvenile received an 8-month detention order.
This is all played through the papers. We have in this area Essex Live, who are in court, typing everything as it goes through. From Blundell's point of view, of course, wherever he was at this particular time, he can go online and he can see, minute by minute, day by day, what Juvenile's case looks like and how it's progressing, all the way to a point of a not guilty verdict.
Blundell is also aware that the testimony of key witness Jamal can be used to his advantage.
If you are going to have any chance of convincing a jury that it wasn't you, it's now.
18 days later, on March 31st, after spending 239 days on the run, Blundell finally handed himself in to the police in Amsterdam.
It was such a short time after the first trial. Like, the suspicion in me says that the two things are linked.
He may have had advice to say, yeah, you'll get a fresh jury. They won't necessarily know everything that went on in the first trial, and they will try you fairly.
Blundell was extradited to the UK and sent to Chelmsford prison until the court was ready to try him.
I wouldn't say it was a relief. I was angry and knowing that we've got to go through all this again.
Here we are now building up to getting ready for the trial of Bradley Blundell. As we're getting near, of course, we are making contact with our witnesses. We make contact with Florence Laws, who says, well, I've actually had a call come through from Ella Colgate. Ella had said that she'd been talking to Bradley, which she obviously found surprising because Bradley is on remand in Chelmsford prison, and that she was going to say that she couldn't remember what had happened, and that Brad had suggested that perhaps that Florence do the same, just say you can't remember.
That made Ella arrestable. She just got out of bed. And I just remember thinking, oh, she's got no idea what's going to happen now. Her immediate reaction was, well, Florence is a liar, she's lied, and made it up.
This young woman has allowed herself to be drawn in to be a supporter of Blundell, to be persuaded by him to pervert the course of justice, to assist him in some way. So it's hard to feel sorry for her, really.
As a result of that, Colgate found herself being questioned and being arrested and charged on conspiracy to pervert the course of justice.
If we put ourselves in Bradley Blundell's shoes at this particular time, a lot of time on his hands because he's in prison, on remand, thinking through how do I get off of this? If he knows the strength of the evidence from a CCTV point of view, he knows straight away that he can blame Juvenile. I think I can build a nice argument around that will convince a jury that the cosh was passed to me and I never had any weapons until that time.
In the first trial, the juvenile and Saul Stanley told the jury that Bradley Blundell was the shooter. But when Bradley Blundell returned, his case was that the juvenile was the shooter and he had the cosh. The problem was that if you added that in to what Jamal said, that the blonde man was the man with the cosh, it gave Bradley Blundell every possibility of running a tenable defence in front of the jury.
I remember having a conversation with Sue about it. She was very concerned about how the second trial would go. Bradley is just going to come back and run exactly the same defence as the juvenile, and potentially there's two people who get away with murder.
I could not deal with the fact of him walking from that. No way.
After an altercation resulting in the murder of John Pordage, Bradley Blundell fled to Europe and was on the run for 239 days before giving himself in. He is awaiting trial with co-defendant Ella Colgate, whom he conspired with to pervert the course of justice.
John was fun. He's sensitive and always wanted to please people.
He was probably the only person that had the energy to put the time and effort into as many people as he did. Nobody should be murdered. Nobody should be murdered.
It was quite a momentous occasion, really, that first full day of the trial, to see him actually in the dock.
Bradley was almost unrecognisable. He had his hair parted and slicked back. He was smart in a suit. He had this strange, emotionless look, like he was above it all, and that we were all just wasting his time.
I locked eyes with him in that courtroom. He just stared at me. Pure evil.
Ella was sobbing throughout, but interestingly, whenever the jury walked out, she'd be laughing and joking with Bradley.
I began to ask Ella Colgate her questions. Ironically, Bradley Blundell's attempt to enlist her to pervert the course of justice rebounded enormously on him. By enlisting her in this conspiracy and turning her into a defendant, I could ask her questions in a very different way. I could cross-examine her. During the first trial, when she'd given evidence, she didn't have any difficulty then in saying things which were helpful for that juvenile. But in order to do so, those answers had to be unhelpful for Bradley Blundell. Now, that was fine in the first trial because he wasn't there in the dock. So those words came back to haunt her because I had that transcript. And as we went through them slowly, one by one, every comment that she made which helped the juvenile but pointed the finger at Blundell, you could see there was a change in her presentation, giving evidence. She'd realised that actually she'd gone down the wrong path.
Phone records proved that Ella Colgate had illegally been in contact with Blundell whilst he was in prison. She was found guilty of conspiracy to pervert the course of justice and received a 12-month jail term.
I think she honestly thought she wasn't guilty about anything. I'm glad that she wasn't coming out that day.
In the first trial, the juvenile and Saul Stanley told the jury that Bradley Blundell was the shooter. His case was that the juvenile was the shooter and he had the cosh.
But with Blundell's legal team using Jamal's conflicting evidence as a key part of his defence, the jury needed convincing that he wasn't the cosh man.
We'd said to the jury, although the defence relied on the fact that Jamal said it was the blonde man with the cosh, he was wrong about that.
But Blundell insisted that he had been passed the cosh by the juvenile.
So that begged the question from counsel, who did a cracking job. Well, when? At what point does the cosh pass to you? Can you help the jury with that?
The prosecution had one more ace in their hand.
What we did was looked at the CCTV very carefully.
The first thing we needed to do was, one, make sure that the jury were clear that the cosh was in the hand of the juvenile. We highlight to the top left the cosh in the hands of the juvenile. It is vital for Blundell to convince this jury that he has been passed the cosh. It was the juvenile that pulled the trigger, not me. I didn't have a gun at all. I didn't have any weapons, in fact, until he passed me the cosh. So as we go through the CCTV, we are asking Blundell to explain to us at what point was he passed the cosh. Tell us, Bradley, when it was that you were passed the cosh. And at some point here, we can no longer see Blundell, we can no longer see the juvenile. And it's about this point that Bradley Blundell decides to say to the jury, now is the time that the juvenile passes me the cosh. What hand have you got it in? I've got it in my right hand. You're absolutely sure? There's no doubt whatsoever that there could be a mistake? You haven't put it into your left? No, it stays in my right hand all the time. We move forward frame by frame, exactly as took place in the courtroom. And there's one frame where we can see Bradley Blundell's right hand, and it's there. And there's nothing in it.
It was a bit of a gotcha moment, if you like. We were able to show there was no way that he had the cosh in his hands at all.
And that point in that trial, a real depth of atmosphere that suddenly came over the whole courtroom. And even Blundell himself, I think, must have thought, I've been caught out.
You could see the change in Blundell's. He knew that there was no way out of that. But do you know, I thought, what if the jury don't see all that?
Having seen one trial and seen the outcome of that, I did worry, having heard the evidence twice, that maybe there just wasn't quite enough to convince the jury that Blundell was guilty of murder.
It comes out over the tannoy that the jury are back.
Martin went, Susie, the verdict's in.
That split second when the jury stand and say, and ask that question, you know, do you find the defendant guilty or not guilty of murder? That split second is just like, oh God, please. And then you hear it.
Guilty.
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 Guilty. And the whole place, I quite understandably, erupted.
Where do we go? Yeah.
It was just like, it was just a relief.
So today is really about this family, this journey, what they've been on for the last 18 months.
It's not going to bring my John back, is it? But it's going to take him off the streets. It's going to take him away from this community. But how long is he going to get?
I think when they heard how he'd actually conducted himself after the shooting, the fact that he disappeared, those weren't the actions of an innocent man.
He had been able to burn clothing. He obviously knew about gunshot residue. He was a sophisticated criminal with possible connections, particularly because he was able to escape.
Bradley Blundell was sentenced to life imprisonment for John's murder, with a minimum term of 22 years. For the offences of conspiracy, perverting the course of justice, handling stolen goods, possession with intent to supply Class A and B drugs, possession of bladed articles and absconding. He received a further 6 years to run concurrently. When sentenced, he smirked and laughed.
Arrogant Bradley stood in the box, laughing and joking.
And Blundell was making signs and laughing. I don't think he was even that bothered. To be honest with you, I think you've just showed yourself up.
For him to smile and laugh when you're given a sentence of 22 years, like, what sort of a person is that?
He won't be coming out for a long time.
This investigation has opened people's eyes.
I think people are much more aware that violent crime, like a shooting, can happen now on the streets of our city.
I don't think that people realise how bad it's got. Everything's changed. Everything's changed. I'm not the same person now I was before. I know that he would be saying, Mum, go and get a life. Have a life. What sort of life?